Perhaps you've encountered people in your life that you felt were beyond approach. Someone who was so negative and filled with doubt that you wondered how they even ceased to exist. Someone so unhappy with the world and the people around them, they seem to create a social black hole that sucks in unfortunate souls. Today, we focus on such people, but with a little twist of humanity. I hope you enjoyed today's episode titled Mrs. Dubose. Mrs. Dubose was not a real person, but one that you can perhaps identify with or have encountered in your own life. The Mrs. Dubose that I'm referring to is a fictional character in the book To Kill a Mockingbird. If you recall, she was a very mean-spirited and grumpy old lady. If you have read the book, she is described as a lady with extremely irritable and impossible to get along with. In the movie, based on the book, she was painted in a similar and not so pleasant light. Listen to the movie scene in which Scout and Jim are hesitant to walk by Mrs. Dubose's house.
Miss Dubose is on her porch. Listen, no matter what she says to you, don't answer her back. There's a Confederate pistol in her lap under her shawl, and she'll kill you quick as look at you. Come on.
Hey, Miss Dubose, don't you say hey to me, you ugly girl. You say good afternoon, Miss Dubose. You come over here when I'm talking to you. You come over here. You listen to me when I'm talking to you. Don't your daddy teach you to respect old people? You come back here, Jane Louise.
Good afternoon, Mr. Bose. My, you look like a picture this afternoon.
You don't say a picture of what?
My goodness gracious, look at your flowers. Have you ever seen anything more beautiful? Miss DuBose, the gardens at Bellingrath have nothing to compare with your flowers.
Oh, I don't think they're as nice as last year.
She gets
I
rich
can't agree with you.
So she forgets to be mean.
I think that your yard is going to be the showplace of this town. Well, grand seeing you, Mr. Bose.
Beyond being disarmed with kindness from Atticus Finch, you notice that Mrs. Dubose may be the meanest, heartless, and most ill-tempered person on the face of the earth. Someone with such a rotten soul, she turns even the slightest of positivity into a dismal failure. But let's look further. The book reveals much more about Mrs. Dubose than the movie ever does, which is usually the case. Mrs. Dubose is most definitely portrayed as a cantankerous and surly old cuss in the book, a person who will say anything that is on her mind regardless of the outcome. In a verbal exchange with Jim, she does not hold back. She is verbally abusive towards Jim and describing his father in no uncertain racist terms. Her opinion of Atticus Finch is so seething that it drives Jim to the point that he becomes out of control, angered. He takes action. A passage from the book best describes what happens next. He did not calm down until he had cut the tops off every camellia bush Mrs. Dubose owned, until the ground was littered with green buds and leaves. In Jim's mind, he was justified. No one will talk that way about his father, and maybe he was right, except in his dad's mind. Atticus Finch did not take exception to her words and saw it as a teachable moment for his son. As punishment, he made Jim read to Mrs. Dubose every day. This must have seemed the harshest of punishments, having to interact with the insufferable Mrs. Dubose on a daily basis. For Jim, this must have seemed like an eternity. However, it ended after several weeks. Ended in a way in Jim's mind that might have forever eased his hatred of Mrs. Dubose. For Mrs. Dubose passed away. Maybe you think he was jubilant that people no longer had to deal with such an awful person. I think not. For the lesson was still yet to be learned for young Jim. Atticus Finch clarifies. Son, I wanted you to see what real courage is. Instead of getting the idea that courage is a man with a gun in his hand, it's when you know when you're licked before you even begin, but you begin anyway, and you see it through, no matter what. You rarely win, but sometimes you do. Mrs. Dubose won, all 98 pounds of her. According to her views, she died beholden to nothing and nobody. She was the bravest person I ever knew. The passage makes me tear up. Gets me every time. I wanted to be like Jim and hate Mrs. Dubose with every fiber of my body, but I couldn't. I couldn't because, like Jim, I learned that Mrs. Dubose was quite human and not the devilish scoundrel she appeared to be. People are not always as they seem. As you learn after her death, as Jim did, Mrs. Dubose was breaking her addiction to morphine. She died in a fight with her inner demons. The key word here is fight. She knew she needed to change. She never gave up, and she fought. What courage that must have taken, to have the courage to fight a battle you know you're going to lose, but to set forth nonetheless. Mrs. Dubose was much more than she appeared on the surface. On the outside, she was rough as a 40-grit sandpaper, but inside, she was a valiant combatant in a fight over drug addiction. As I have, re-examine those in your life that you've wrongly judged. People who may be battling the effects of mental illness, PTSD, drug addiction, and other demons. Maybe these people are desperately trying to reach out to someone. Maybe that someone is you. Take the time to get to know someone who might be perceived as being beyond approach. Someone who is so negative and mean that they're the embodiment of the Grinch himself. Maybe you can lend an ear that might be the catalyst for change in someone's life. Before you judge someone by their behavior, consider what is causing that behavior. Maybe they're like Mrs. Dubose, who has courage on the inside by fighting the inner demons, but on the outside those same demons come bubbling to the surface. Perhaps if we all had a little bit more patience and understanding, we would learn the valuable lesson it is to become human together.